I've been trying to get my buddy to read Mao's Quotations. I can't get him to do it. But it's good. It's so good. Cast may not be horrible, but of course it will have a liberal bent for sure. For sure. But yeah, Mao's Quotations is awesome. I've read On Contradiction, and I've read On Physical Education actually because I think it's super interesting. One of Mao's lesser read texts. What else have I read from Mao? I don't know. I've done obviously tons of research into China and the construction of modern China. It's one of my favorite videos that I've done on the YouTube, which talks in detail about the economic policies that were carried out under Mao. But in Mao's Quotations, he's talking about strategy, talking about economic policy, talking about times during the revolutionary struggle, the pre-revolutionary struggle, the process of construction and how to defeat imperialism. And obviously, this was part of the Cultural Revolution, was people were supposed to read the Little Red Book, and communists were carrying it around and reading it and studying it all the time. And today, China regrets the Cultural Revolution. They say that was the major mistake of Mao. But regardless, you can kind of see what people were being taught, or as we hear in the U.S., indoctrinated with in China at this time, which is fair to say they were, being indoctrinated with it. But for years prior, they had been indoctrinated with colonial ideology, imperialist ideology. They had been subjugated to horrible exploitation. The British had gotten the Chinese people purposely had gotten the Chinese people addicted to opium, so that they'd be easier to exploit. You had a horrible, exploitative, and oppressive and violent landlord class who ruled over the semi-peasant, semi-feudal population of China. So in certain ways, like there were certain cultural practices that needed to be changed, like the policy of foot binding. It was very common for young girls to bind up their feet very tight every day so they would be curved at an unnatural angle because it was considered beautiful or whatever. There were certain cultural practices that Mao and the communists wanted to do away with. And then they wanted to move people towards a more collective, more socialist society, economically as well as culturally. So Mao's laying out a lot of that in here, but really he's just laying out, what is good revolutionary practice. And as Lenin did in the Foundations of Leninism, Mao sort of breaks the revolution in China into various periods. It's like here we have the pre-revolutionary period where, and also it's different though than Stalin because Russia under before the October Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution was an imperialist country. They were one of the empires who was fighting in World War I for colonial expansion, versus China was a country victimized by colonialism and imperialism. So they were fighting at first against the Japanese colonizers. So that's the first period that Mao talks about. And then they had to fight the Civil War against the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists who they were allied with in the struggle against the colonizers, but who were pro-capitalist and very reactionary and right-wing, and eventually accepted funding and arming from the U.S., which brought them into a civil war with Mao and the communists. The communists won. So that's obviously another period, the period of communist revolution after the anti-colonial sort of popular revolution. And then you have the period of construction of constructing and developing infrastructure, developing industry, industrializing agriculture so people wouldn't starve and you wouldn't have a peasant class anymore, doing land redistribution, so taking the feudal landlords and giving their land back to the peasants. A lot of the landlords were killed by the peasants during the revolutionary period after the years of exploitation that the landlords had inflicted on the peasants. And yeah, Mao's just laying out what the strategy of the Communist Party of China was during all these periods, and why they were able to be successful or the mistakes they made. And he's also laying out, sort of a guide. This is what individual communists should do, and this is how Marxist Leninists should analyze the world. And, there's stuff to criticize in there for sure, as far as it being slightly dogmatic. But one of the main things I noticed while reading this book is that Mao would be against all of the modern Marxist Leninist Maoist third worldists. The people who are like, we can't have a revolution in the U.S. We just have to wait for all the colonized countries to have revolutions, and then just wait for the U.S. to topple. um, or yeah, people who think dogmatically like that. Mao was not a dogmatic thinker, and there are places where the things he says are in direct opposition to what most the Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, third worldists believe. The sort of Jason Unruhs of the world, if anyone knows him. So Mao is not dogmatic; he's absolutely materialist. Not overly dogmatic. I guess there are small parts where where I think I would criticize Mao looking back in retrospect as being like slightly ultra left, which is why I think Maoism has been taken probably by the CIA and CIA backed what do you call it, controlled opposition groups. Have taken Maoism and made it into this sort of ultra left pro imperialist deviation that is Maoist third worldism. um, but yeah, Mao would be against all that dogmatism. He's mostly a very good materialist, and he also lays out like military strategy. And here was the last thing I wanted to say. He lays out, here's how communists should fight. Here's how communists should carry out battles. Here's what the soldiers should do. Here's how soldiers should train. And I have so many buddies who joined the military in order to pay for college, or who joined it to wrestle for a military team. um and it's just so interesting. They, pretty much everyone who's in the military, if you know people in the military, they complain. A lot of them hate it. A lot of it's very irrational and stupid the way that the military does things. A lot of people become institutionalized in the military and then get no help, transitioning back into the real world once they get out. It's there's a lot of terrible things about the imperialist US military. Who knew? But that's why it's interesting to read Mao's quotations and read what he's saying about the military. The military needs to help people. When the military doesn't have fighting to do, they should be involved in economic construction, helping the people build things. Uh, the military should be studying theory, and they should be educating themselves, and they should, constantly be working to have good relations with the masses and to serve the masses. And there should be good relations between the officers and the soldiers. And any places where there aren't good relations, here's what we should do to fix that. Which, again, if you know anybody in the military, there are rarely good relations between the officers and the soldiers. So it's just interesting seeing how a socialist military or a socialist army is structured and organized compared to a capitalist imperialist army. A socialist one is so much better. I've been trying to get one of my military friends to read this, but no luck so